Our today's lesson is on solving quadratic equations where the leading coefficient is greater than 1 by factoring. Factoring quadratic equations with the leading coefficient greater than 1 is more challenging than quadratics with the leading coefficient of 1. Okay, so here we have to factor a quadratic term where the coefficient is greater than 1. So there's several possibilities, but one way to eliminate all the possibilities is this. You simply take the leading coefficient, which is 2, and multiply it to the constant 7. That gives you 14. And then you take the middle term. Remember when we, in the lesson about multiplying binomials, the middle term has to add up to, in this case, 15x. So we're going to take this 15 and put this up here. And you want to say to yourself, what two numbers multiply to 14, but at the same time have a sum of 15? If you think about that carefully, it has to be 14 and 1. Because 14 times 1 is 14, and 14 plus 1 is 15, which will match that middle term. And what you want to do is use the geometric box. And we're going to work backwards to get the two binomials that multiply to this trinomial. So you want those two factors. You've got to work backwards this time. And the easy way to do this is to use the concept of areas. We know that this first square, this first rectangle here, has to be 2x squared. And we know that one of these squares has to multiply to 7. And what this does, it gives you the two terms that add up to the middle term, 15x. So I'm going to put 14x and x, because this has to add up to 15x. And to get the factors, we just go backwards and figure out the areas of each rectangle. And if you get that, you have the two factors for the trinomial. And one way to do this is to get the greatest common factor between two terms. You have 2x squared, you have 14x. The greatest common factor here is 2x. That's the greatest factor. I divide both into 2x squared and 14x. And then just go the other way around. What times 2x gives you 2x squared? Well, just x. X is the only term times 2x that gives you 2x squared. Then you come down here. If this has a length from here to here is x. Well, what times x is x? Well, positive 1. And then from, the property of rectangles, opposite sides have to be the same. So from here to here is 2x also. So 2x times what is 14x? And it has to be 7. And that's your factors. You have positive 7, you have positive 1. And it works down here because 1 times 7 is 7. And you have your two factors. It's 2x plus 1 times x plus 7. And that's the quickest way you can do this, rather than going through a lot of combinations. Let's try another one. What do you do when you have an even coefficient that's greater than 1? There's several possibilities. Lots of numbers multiply to 8. You have 2 and 4, 8 and 1. How do you eliminate the different combinations? Again, just make the little chart. 8 times negative 3, remember, watch the signs, is negative 24. But you need to have a middle term that adds up to negative 10. I'm going to put negative 10 up here. So think to yourself, what two terms multiplies to negative 24, but at the same time add up to negative 10? And it turns out that negative 12 and 2 do this. Negative 12 times 2 is negative 24. But you add these two, you get negative 10. And then you want to make the rectangles again. So let's say the first area of the first rectangle has to be 8x squared. This has to be negative 3. It doesn't matter which order you put these in, by the way. So I'm going to put negative 12 here. I could have put it here. put negative 12x, and I'm going to put 2x, because these two have to add up to negative 10x. And just work your way backwards. Get the greatest common factor between 8x squared and negative 12x. And the greatest number term that would divide into that would be 4x. And then what times 4x is 8x squared? Well, it has to be 2x, because 2 times 4 is 8, x times x squared. All right, and then come down here, and what's the greatest common factor between 2x and negative 3? Well, there is no common factor there, so the only common factor would be 1. And what times 4x gives you negative 12x? And that would have to be negative 3. And then just check it. Make sure that 1 times negative 3 does indeed give you this area inside that rectangle. 1 times 2x should be 2x. And once you have that, that's it. You have the two factors. This is 4x plus 1 and 2x minus 3. We're going to use this to solve quadratic equations. For example, solve 5y squared minus 2y minus 7 equals 0. All right, we're going to do the same thing. You're going to factor this. So 5 times negative 7, that gives you negative 35. And the middle term is negative 2. So what two terms multiply to negative 35, but at the same time add up to negative 2? And if you think hard enough, that should be 5 and negative 7. 5 times negative 7 is negative 35, but if I add them up, I get a sum of negative 2. So you go ahead and draw your rectangles. All right, so you know this has to be 5y squared. This has to be negative 7. And you're going to put negative 7y, 5y. And you want to take the greatest common factor out of it. So in this case, between 5y squared and negative 7y, 5 and 7, there's no common factor there, but you could take a y out of there. Then what times y gives you 5y squared? Just simply 5y. And then the greatest common factor between 5y and negative 7 is 1. It's the only factor you can take out of that. Positive 1. All right, so what times y is negative 7y? And that would just be negative 7. So your factor is going to be y plus 1 and 5y minus 7. And you're going to set this equal to 0. And you're going to set each factor equal to 0, just like we did in the previous lesson once you have the two factors. So you have y plus 1 equals 0. And you have 5y minus 7 equals 0. So if you subtract 1 to both sides, we get one solution of y equals negative 1. Here you're going to add 7 to both sides. So you have 5y equals 7, which implies that y equals 7/5. So we have two answers. Y equals negative 1 and 7/5. All right, what happens if you get an equation like this? You have solve 2n squared plus 15 equals 11n. The first thing you do is put that, make it a trinomial out of this and put it in descending order. So you're going to move this 11n to the other side. So the opposite of 11n is negative 11n. So what you're going to have now is 2n squared minus 11n plus 15 equals 0. And now you want to factor this trinomial and set the factors equal to 0. And you're going to do it the same way as we did before. You're going to take the first term, the leading coefficient, and multiply it to the constant. So 2 times 15 is 30. But we have to figure out what two terms multiply to 30 but add up to negative 11, because the middle term here is negative 11. So if you think about that, that would be negative 5 and negative 6. Negative 5 times negative 6 is positive 30, but if I add them up, I get negative 11. So I'm going to make my box and get my two factors. All right, so I can put 2n squared, 15 here. You put negative 6n and negative 5n. And if I take the greatest common factor between 2n squared and negative 6n, that's going to give me I believe 2n. And what times 2n gives me 2n squared? That should be n. And what times 2n gives me negative 6n? That should be negative 3. All right, and what times n is negative 5n? That should be negative 5. And negative 5 times negative 3 should be positive 15. So it checks out. So your two factors are going to be 2n minus 5 times n minus 3, and you set that equal to 0. And you're going to set each factor equal to 0. So 2n minus 5 equals 0, and we have n minus 3 equals 0. This tells us that n has to equal positive 3, and n here has to be 5 halves. So n is 3, and then we have 5 halves. All right, here's a special case we need to look at. Solve 9x squared minus 25 equals 0. And if you recall from the lesson about multiplying binomials, there's a special case where the middle term cancels out. You got to remember that because you can do that in reverse when we factor. First thing you want to do is notice that 9 is a square number, and so is x squared. And 25 is also a square number. And you have a subtraction sign between it. Remember, that's called the difference of squares. So when you see that pattern, we can easily factor that because we know that the square root of 3 is 9. I mean, the square root of 9 is 3, so you can say 3x minus 5 times 3x plus 5 equals 0. Because that's the pattern. Because that you can have the exact same term but opposite signs, the middle term cancels out. We learned that from the previous lesson. So when I factor, I just simply take the square root of the first term. Square root of 9x squared is 3x. The square root of 25 is 5. And then write the same term, write the opposite signs. Now I set both factors equal to 0. So x is going to equal 5/3. And x here is going to equal negative 5/3. So x in general is plus and minus 5/3. Okay, I solve 12y squared plus 3y equals 54. Again, you want to put it in standard form, and you want to put it in descending order. So you're going to subtract the 54 to both sides. So you're going to have 12y squared plus 3y minus 54 equals 0. And before you start multiplying the leading coefficient to the constant, just look at all the terms. You have a 12, you have a 3, a negative 54. You can divide both sides of this equation by 3 and make your work much easier, because 3 divides into 12, 3, and 54, and 0. So I'm going to divide everything by 3 first, because I can get an equivalent equation, and it's easier to work with smaller numbers. So if I divide 3 into 12, now I have 4y squared, and that becomes 1y. And instead of 54, now I have 18. And 3 divides into 0 0 times. And that's much easier to factor. We're going to do the same thing. Multiply 4 times negative 18. That should give you negative 72. And we have to find two numbers that add up to positive 1, but at the same time multiply to negative 72. If you think about that hard enough, you'll see that 9 and negative 8 work. 9 times negative 8 is negative 72, but if I add them up, I get positive 1. Then I can go and make my areas. I can put 4y squared. I have negative 18. I can put 9y and negative 8y. And then use the greatest common factor. You can go either way, by the way. I can get the greatest common factor of 4y squared and negative 8y and put that factor up here. That'll be 4y. And then what times 4y is 4y squared? That's just simply y. And what times y is 9y? That's just simply 9. If I take the greatest common factor between negative 8y and negative 18, that's just simply 2. And I have my factors. That should be negative 2, by the way. Sorry, negative 2 should be the greatest common factor. And if you multiply it, make sure it checks out. Negative 2 times 4y is negative 8. Negative 2 times 9 should be negative 18. So those are my two factors. I have y minus 2. 4y plus 9 equals 0. And now I'm going to set those two factors equal to 0. So let me write what I had here. I had y minus 2. And I had 4y plus 9 equals 0. So if I set these two equal to 0, y is going to equal 2, and y here is going to be negative 9/4. And that concludes this lesson for today.